What's up, Toro students? Welcome back. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Santiago here.
And this is History Talks. If you don't remember, History Talks is that time in your world history class where you have a lecture video packaged nicely together and an Edpuzzle where you can go through it as many times as you need to, as long as you are going through it and answering the quick checkpoint questions within the actual lesson. And as you guys can see from our title, we have a new conversation when it comes to our class, a new unit called the Cold War. The Cold War. Before we start focusing on what this war is, hot or cold or whatever, I think it's time for us to do a quick recap on what was the last things we learned within our history class.
All right, guys, quick recap. We left off with World War II and the Holocaust. Those have now both ended. Germany and Japan have surrendered, and the US and Soviet troops have entered into Europe and have liberated the concentration camps. After, the Soviet Union and the United States have emerged as two dominant superpowers. We have to remember that a good portion of Europe has been destroyed, utterly destroyed, both financially, politically, and physically. Their nation has been put into crumbles. And the only ones that are really able to survive this is the United States, number one, because they aren't physically fighting there, and two, the Soviet Union, just because they are so big. The nations throughout Europe and Asia have been significantly damaged, both physically and economically, by the war. NATO and their allies work to begin to rebuild those nations. They begin to support them both financially and politically. However, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States due to conflicting ideologies. Now, if you remember, the Soviet Union and the United States have never really gotten along. They have very different and conflicting ideas about how countries should be ran. They are allies for a short period of time during World War II, but that quickly fades after the war.
That's right. So as the dust settles from World War II and its outcomes, we start to see those two allies who were once together on the same team quickly split off and become rivals in this next stage of global control. So before we go into further lessons, let's make sure we understand what are the main lessons of today. What are the things we need to focus for today? Well, there are two standards that we're going to be focusing on. As you guys can see, one of them is to compare the economic and military power shifts caused by the war, including the Yalta Pact, the development of the nuclear weapons, Soviet control over Eastern European nations, and the economic recoveries of Germany and Japan. Not only are we going to focus on that standard, but another one we're going to do is analyzing the causes of the Cold War with the free world on one side and the Soviet client states on the other, including their competitions or influence over other parts of the world. Now, there's one essential question we have here, folks, and that question is, how do power struggles between ideologies affect societies? How do power struggles between ideologies affect societies? Now, don't get too caught up on that fancy word called ideologies. If you see that definition there, it simply is just saying a set of ideas and principles, especially the one that serves as the foundation for the economic and political theory and policy. Just like Ms. Garcia said, these two superpowers have very different thinkings of how society should function. And in this war, they're gonna be willing to fight for it as they try to express it on other nations.
A little bit more backstory and introduction to the Soviet Union and the United States. You may remember to these people, Harry S. Truman, who was involved during World War II, and Joseph Stalin during World War II as well. But during this time period of the Cold War, we have several different new players who emerge. We have 8 different presidents that are elected, and run during the Cold War. As you remember, in the United States, we are a democracy, and presidents will serve either a 1 4-year term or potentially they will serve 2 terms for 4 years, total of 8 years total. During that whole time period where we have 8 different presidents, over in the Soviet Union, they have 4 leaders. So their time periods are very different compared to ours. There was no set structure in the Soviet Union during this time of the Cold War.
So, like we just said, ideologies are the big thing when it comes to the Cold War. And there's different ones that are going to be promoted. The 2 main ones are going to be the ones you first see here, one of them being capitalism. If you don't know by this point, you live in a capitalism society here in the United States. And what that means is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Meaning that when it comes to business and money and markets and everything like that, capitalist people believe that the government should not be getting involved on how that should be handled, and rather it should be based on individuals to make the right decisions based on their own personal self-interests. Now, there's some cause and effects that come with that, as you guys can see with our bullet points, one of them being a 2-class system in which those with capital or money and those who are the working class who will work for those who have the money. Another point is goods and services are privately owned. That's a big emphasis when it comes to capitalism. Everyone has an individual role in that and choice on how things are handled, the distribution of products and money and stuff like that. Once again, in exchange for all that choice, they push away government and any government rules or intervention as they think that government would be a problem within the economy system. Lastly, this can result in a concentration in wealth in the hands of a small group of people, typically those who have the money and are the business owners, compared to their workers and the other classes.
In comparison to capitalism, we have an alternative economy, which is communism. Communism is described as a political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production. For example, mines, mills, factories, and the natural resources of a society. Communism is not inherently bad, but we do get a lot of bad reps for communism. In its origins, where the idea for communism comes from, as you may remember previous units, that oligarchies or kings or queens were the people who had a majority of the wealth and ownership over the resources. They decided where and when things were spent and what was purchased. What the communist comes from the idea that they're taking away that ownership and giving it back to the people. And therefore, there is no oligarchy. There are no few people who are concentrating all of the wealth within society, that it goes back to the people. But like in a lot of situations, in theory, it does not always actualize in reality. And so in communism, there can be some hiccups. For example, there's a state ownership of resources. The state is the one who owns everything and distributes it. While everything can be equal, equal is not always enough. Another thing is that we begin to have a bureaucratic elite, much like an oligarchy. They have a common good. So decisions are not necessarily made by a vote, but rather what is appearing to be for the common good. Lastly, they usually have a single party, and this is where things can get dangerous because, like we discussed in the totalitarianism unit, when you have one single party, there are no oppositional views. And without different ideas, we often can get stuck in one set of ideas.
Another ideology is democracy, something that we're a little bit more familiar with, right? It's a system of government set up by the whole population or all eligible members of a state, typically through elective representatives. Some of the elements that are embedded in democracy that we're probably more familiar with are we're ruled by a constitution. We have our rights and our liberties. We have the rights to revolt, power of authority intended by the people. We have the power, and voting, of course.
Very nice. And Mr. Santiago, democracy, is that America then? That sounds a lot like America.
That is us, the United States.
Yeah, so that would be the political realm when it comes to how we function, when it comes to political aspects. Now, when it comes to back to communism or Soviet Union, their other angle would be considered dictatorship. As we understand with communism, there was a lot of power centralized within government. And with their first leader, Joseph Stalin, there was a big emphasis on the theme of dictatorship and totalitarian. Now, if we don't remember, dictatorship is a form of government characterized by a single leader or a group of leaders, and little or no tolerance for political pluralism or independent media. So just like how Ms. Garcia said, this is when one team gets to call all the shots and refuses to compete with other teams and their ideas, which we can see where there's a slippery slope with that. Obviously, with dictatorships and totalitarianism, we know some of the characteristics of it, at least from our last unit we did. Some of those being indoctrination, propaganda, censorship, charisma, one-party rule, economic control, extreme nationalism, and good old terror.
A quick checkpoint. Why does capitalism and communism not get along? Again, why does capitalism and communism not get along?
Take a look at that table and see if you can answer that question. Perfect. Let's go ahead and carry on then. So, before we go further, I think there's something we need to emphasize. Why is this war called cold? Why all of a sudden is there temperatures to war? All the other wars we talked about were just war, American war. You know, they were all just central, but this one is called Cold War. Where is this coming from? Well, this is what we need to understand with our next slide. When we say Cold War, that means that this war is going to be different than other warfare. It's not like World War II. Cold War is when battles are fought politically and physically between the two opposing sides or superpowers. But this is the caveat. Yes, they're fighting, but the armies of the conflicting nations often do not fight each other physically. So you might have a rival, but you are not making direct contact with their face in that war. Instead, you're doing other methodical ways of trying to mess that other team up without firing that bullet directly at them. There's a lot of different ways they come up with doing that. But essentially with the Cold War, there is no official declaration of war. There's no official war that starts necessarily. But there is this unofficial war that starts to feel very official around the world as the tensions rise and the fears of what will come with it start to ensue.
One of the ways in which we begin to have Cold War conflicts is through what's called a proxy war. Okay, buckle up because it's about to get confusing. A proxy war is instigated by a major power which does not itself become involved. In this case, the major powers that we're talking about are the Soviet Union and the United States. They are the ones who are instigating it. They are the ones who don't like each other. They want to fight each other. But if they do fight each other, it's going to start World War III. And neither of them want that. So instead of the United States and the Soviet Union physically fighting each other like during World War II, this is what they do instead. What they do is they will have puppet governments. Those puppet governments will physically fight each other. And the superpowers cannot fight each other. They use their allies to fight their fights for them. For example, let's say, paint the picture. You guys are out at lunchtime and I don't like Mr. Martinez, right? I want to fight Mr. Martinez. But if me and Mr. Martinez fight, then we're both going to get suspended. So instead of me and Mr. Martinez fighting, Mr. Martinez is going to go to Mr. Santiago and he's going to say, Mr. Santiago, you are my ally. I need you to go fight Ms. Garcia's ally. Okay, so my ally, let's say Mr. Carter and Mr. Santiago are going to fight, because if they fight, it's not going to start World War III. It's only going to start World War III if it is Ms. Garcia and Mr. Martinez fighting. Okay, so instead of us physically fighting, we send our puppet governments, Mr. Santiago and Mr. Carter, to fight each other. And they throw hands. They physically fight. We're behind the strings. We're sending them money. We're telling them what to do, but we never actually fight, which is why it's a Cold War. We're never heating up. We are using our proxies. We are using Mr. Santiago and Mr. Carter to fight the war for us.
And now the hot war, it's actually on. Physically military conflict battle between two opposing sides. It's on. This is the USA versus Russia, like what Ms. Garcia was stating earlier. This is the actual war between two armies carried out on their own territory. So this is real wars. So this is where someone might declare it. Someone might publicly declare it. It could be United States declaring we are declaring war against Japan.
That's right. And in those hot wars, it's more of that idea that those two superpowers are putting their hands on everything and are making those physical contact and fighting each other. So that the blood is essentially on their hands in that aspect versus Cold War, where they rather have the blood on someone else's hands. But regardless, that fight is because of they pushed it and started it.
A quick checkpoint, guys. What's the difference between a hot war versus a Cold War? Again, the difference between a hot war versus a Cold War.
Please respond to that to be able to continue further. Well done. So there is some differences there, folks, and I really hope that you guys can see the differences within those. But when it comes to our conversation of the Cold War, we figured that would be a great spot to stop for today's episode. We just wanted us to understand the differences between this war versus the many others that came before. Why is it that these two countries are deciding to have differences? And we're going to see how that unfolds in its first places that it starts having an impact on, which is going to be Europe. Okay. But that is what we'll be doing, folks, on our next episode. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for us. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Mr. Martinez.
I'm Ms. Garcia.
Mr. Santiago here.
And we are signing out. Thank you guys so much for being here. And please finish up your notes and any other questions that follow.